they began to wait. The band was jumping and the drum began to swing. You should have heard the locked out jailbird sing. Let it rock, everybody let it rock. Everybody in the whole cell block was dancing to the jailhouse rock. Spider Murphy played his tenor saxophone. Little Joe was blowing on the slide trombone. The drummer boy from Illinois would crash, boom, bang. The whole rhythm section was a Purple Gang. Let it rock, everybody let it rock. Everybody in the whole cell block was dancing to the jailhouse rock. Number 47 said to number 3, "You the cutest jailbird I ever did see. I sure would be delighted with your company. Come on and do the jailhouse rock with me. Let it rock, everybody let it rock. Everybody in the whole cell block was dancing to the jailhouse rock. Rock, 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 rock.
Okay. Everybody awake? Am I coming through here? Let's see who's here. Carrie's here. Lucas. And just Carrie and Lucas? Okay. Anybody else here chime in? So obviously, yeah. Should be interesting. Yeah. It's funny. The reason I showed that, other than it's just the most rocking tune of all time, maybe the best bass line, I think, of all time, and probably the best music video of all time. I'm going to talk about today about Slippery Slopes. And whenever I think of Slippery Slopes, I think of Elvis because, most of the people that hang out here are of my generation. And when I was young, back in the 60s, I missed Elvis. But my brothers, I don't really know if they were Elvis fans or not. But the one person who was borderline obsessed with Elvis was my grandmother. And I can't think of one of the very first childhood memories I have of my grandmother just being upset and out of her mind about this Elvis Presley and the way he's up there swinging his hips on that stage, driving those girls crazy. AC's here. So AC and everybody that missed it, I just showed Jailhouse Rock, the video by Elvis Presley. And she just could not get over the fact that this young man, good looking, talented young man, would be up there on the stage, dancing around like that, swinging his hips, driving those young girls crazy. And at that time, Elvis was passé. When you got to the once the Beatles came along, nobody cared about Elvis. I guess until he did that special in the late 60s where he's in the all black jumpsuit or whatever. But even then, Elvis was uncool. Elvis was very cool when my brothers were growing up, but he was very uncool when I was came along. So, but what got me thinking of that is I heard a comment the other day or a few months back from Tim Pool, who I use a lot on this show. I use a lot of his stuff. And one of the guys said, and it wasn't a Christian at all, but he was talking about the election, how things are changing in this country, how bad things got in this country before this last election, how far the culture had fallen. Because Tim Pool has a culture war podcast. He's not a Christian, but he's a secular guy who realizes the culture wars are important more than most Christians realize. The culture wars are important. Okay. And this guy said that really what's happened in this country, that every slippery slope argument since Elvis has come true. And it's the first time I've ever heard anybody say that. And I've wanted to talk about it ever since, because it's really true. When Elvis came along, it was a complete departure. Rock and roll itself was such a radically complete departure from the music, other than, I guess, would you say in black culture, which it came out of blues, that kind of thing. But rock and roll itself really was a product of the baby boomers, because World War II, I think, was the third turning? Third turning was World War II, because there's 4 turnings, right? Every 80 years, if you're familiar with that. And I think we're in the 4th turning right now, or we just came out of it with that stuff, So first turning being the Revolution, second turning being the Civil War, third turning being World War II. And the technology that was unleashed in World War II, the prosperity that was released afterwards, meant that there was a generation of young people that didn't have to work and scrape and work the farm or work the factory to survive. Their parents were now living the American dream, being home ownership, a bit of prosperity and free time, and the technology, record players, radio, the free time and the money to go to rock and roll shows. Chloe, hi, Chloe. We're talking rock and roll here. And so rock and roll came at this time, and people were like, it was such a departure. It was, and up until then, you could call it sexual repression if you want. But the things and behavioral repression, if you want, but the things represented by Elvis up there, swinging his hips, like my grandmother used to say, unleashed, these people said, this will unleash forces in our society that we have been trying to hold back, that humankind, at least in Western civilization, had been holding back and suppressing, because a society can't survive if these things are unleashed. At least a society that's scrambling to survive, working the farm, working in these factories, but sewing their own clothes, growing their own food, whatever it is, having chunks of ice to put in the ice box every day. And if that Iceman didn't show up, your food's spoiled, right? If you're in the city, or if you're in the country and your crops failed, you were done, because there wasn't a supermarket fully stocked down the street that you can go to get your food. And I think it was Jordan Peterson said this. He said 1895, but let's call it the turn of the 20th century. Nobody had anything. He was talking in the context of women and men, and how women were held down in society and men were somehow more privileged. He said nobody had anything until 1895 anyway, so everybody was in the same boat. But around the turn of the 20th century, when the Industrial Revolution started to take hold, and people were all of a sudden beginning to be mobile, and they're moving to the cities away from the farm, because food could be produced and stored and distributed away from a farm. That's kind of what started this modern society rolling. World War I, World War II, World War I comes down. We were pretty much unscathed by that huge depression, horrible depression. My mom lived through it. She never stopped telling me stories of how horrible it was in the depression. They always say, don't ever say the good old days were always good. That they're not. They were horrible. But then World War II came along, and that's what unleashed the Industrial Revolution and started the technology revolution. And all the investment that was done in that war paid off afterwards. And all of a sudden we have this prosperous society where people have leisure time, and young people are now something different than they were before. Before, young people were just workers in training. Now they are teenagers, or they're adolescents, or they're pre-adolescents, or whatever. And all of a sudden they have this entertainment, this thing called television comes along, and this music is on the radio, and radios are more, radios aren't, you're not just sitting in the living room listening to the big Victrola, right? Or whatever the radios were. And television came along. So you were actually watching something. You were watching Elvis swing his hips on Ed Sullivan, right? And later on, the Beatles. You watch the Beatles with their long hair on television. And this changed fundamentally things. And people were saying these will unleash forces in society that have been held down. If we weren't repressing them, they were at least being held down because we didn't have leisure time and we didn't have freedom from our drudgery and our work to focus on them. Well, here comes Elvis, and he's the first person to break that mold. And maybe movies had done it a little bit before then, going to theaters. And when Clark Gable said, "Frankly, Scarlett, I don't give a damn," that was a big one too. That may have been the first thing that unleashed these forces, but that was horrific too. Oh my! If we let him say that word in the movies, what will we have next? Other cussing in movies? Again, these were slippery slope arguments, and people have been mocking them. Okay, well, Lucas, you got a comment here. There's been nothing fresh since the 2060s was a good decade. I would beg to differ with you there, Lucas. The 60s, I grew up in the 60s. The 60s, I do not glorify that time at all. But I'll get to that a little bit later. But so when this guy said this, he said every slippery slope argument since Elvis has come true. It really, I thought, you know what, he's right, because rock and roll, Elvis, since he was swinging his hips, did kick off the hedonization, if that's a word, of our youth, to where the point today. I was going to show a video on Coachella, but I didn't. I ran out of time. But it was Lady Gaga up on the stage, Coachella. I mean, or you can go back to Miley Cyrus twerking on whatever TV show that was. Okay. Well, back in the 50s, they wouldn't even imagine that. Or maybe they wouldn't imagine that. I don't know. But they were right about Elvis. And I was a rock and roll guy. I was a 60s rock and roll guy. I was 70s for sure. I grew up in the 70s, and the 70s, everything from, Neil Young and Jim Croce to Fleetwood Mac and the Eagles. I'm all about that music, and I'm all about Elvis's music. I love that video I showed, Joe, is, like I said, I think it's the best music video of all time. But they were right. They were totally right about that. Television, they used to call it the idiot box. We can't just sit there watching this screen all day, or even a couple hours a day. What's that going to do to our children? Well, it's going to make them screen addicts. Okay. And you can go all, that's not hard to follow that progression. Okay. About screen addiction. And we're dealing with screen addiction today. So what I want, and that got to another slippery slope that I remember much more, or much more recent. And that was back in the day, back in the 90s, 80s and 90s, when computers were first taking hold. This was not. Okay. So this is the effects of screen time on children. And there's so much research now on the effects of screen time on children. And they have all these, actually, this is more guidelines that they offer, because the research of the anxiety and the the varied effects on mental health, academic achievement, and social skills, and the importance of balancing screen time with physical activity and healthy habits. And it goes on to talk about all the different ways in which screens are affecting our children. A friend of mine, Dave Murrow, who wrote Why Men Hate Going to Church, has also written a book on, we call it Drowning in Screen Time, and all the effects that screen addiction, and actually what we're doing right now, is having not only on youth, but it's also on people in general. We always talk about our children and how much screen time they are, but we never talk about adults and how much screen time adults are consuming and the effects it's having on adults. So, but screen addiction is a very real thing. Well, back in the 80s and the 90s, when computers were first taking over or first coming to prominence, back in the 80s, it first came, I remember, I think it was 1982 when the personal computer was first invented. Before then, computers were giant things that you had to have computer cards to program, you had punch cards, you put them in. If you're too young to know what that means, look it up. You'd be very interested to see that. But then computers became personal, and then they became in people's homes. And by the time I started getting into them in the early 90s, they were getting fairly sophisticated, and people were spending more and more time on them, and they were devoting more and more of their resources and control of their lives to them. And, everybody was full speed ahead, but there were a few, Luddites like me. I'm the guy with the, I don't have my iPhone, but I'm the guy that has the home button still on his iPhone, right? And this computer I'm on is 14 years old or 10 years old, 11 years old. So we were very worried. People like me, I resisted computers for a long time because I don't need it. I won't use it. And I don't want to give my life over. I don't want to give up one dimension of my life. I live a 3D life. We live 3D lives. But with a computer or an iPhone, you're living a 2D life. And my children, our children, my stepchildren, have grown up in basically a 2D reality. Everything they've done has been centered around a screen, a two-dimensional screen that has the illusion of 3 dimensions, but it's 2-dimensional. And it's not real life. It's just pixels on this 2-dimensional screen. So back then, when we were talking about the dangers of computers, everybody with a computer who was in development of computers was going, no, that's not going to happen. The computers are going to unleash all kinds of possibilities, and it's going to be prosperous for society. And he was going to elevate humanity to levels it's never seen before, which in some ways it has. I can't imagine life without computers and what we would do. God forbid that there's an EMP pulse. Thank God that weather balloon that flew over the United States a couple of years ago didn't have a nuclear device in it that would have taken out the grid, right? But at the same time, we're seeing the effects of devoting our lives to these screens is having, especially on our kids, the anxiety levels that they're having, the trouble that they're having developing relationships and doing human interaction, the trouble they're having in work on focusing on a task for any given amount of time, the lack of physical dexterity that they're demonstrating because of too much screen time and not enough time playing with blocks, or riding their trike or whatever it is. Okay. AC. Yep. I work. And you used to work on a word processor. I love 5 1/4 floppies, man. I wish we were back to 5 1/4 floppies. That would be great. So again, these are all slippery slopes. And of course, the ultimate slippery slope with computers is now artificial intelligence, which I've talked about before. And it's the more and more these new artificial AI models are coming out, the more frightened people are becoming. And the more we're finding out just exactly what AI might do and what the creators of AI are telling us is happening. That might be the ultimate slippery slope. And to put it in a Christian context, Ben and I will be talking about this tomorrow, but social issues, the slippery slope arguments are mostly social issues. Like I said, the biggest one that I focus on today has been rock and roll. But you can go back to abortion. Back in the day, the arguments were made before Roe versus Wade was enacted back in the 70s of what would happen. Another one is no fault divorce. When I was a kid, before I think the 60s or 70s, you had to prove something. You had to prove your case to get a divorce. Marriage was held in such high regard that if you wanted out, you had to prove it, that someone was at fault. It's called fault divorce or something like that. But then they had no fault divorce, where if you just wanted to get divorced because irreconcilable differences, you just did. And what that would do to marriage. I was thinking back to around that time a little bit later when the first that comes to mind is Anita Bryant, when there was some laws enacted in Florida, I think it was, that were trying to, were the first, what do you say, LGBT or gay right laws that were coming non-discrimination, and how she's fought that, saying, this is a slippery slope. This will affect our children. I think her organization was called Save the Children. And because she said, eventually, if we allow this, they will recruit our children and this will affect our children, which has, here we are 50 years later, 40, 50 years later, man. Yeah. And, we are battling now the effects of that and the impacts had on our children, where our children are actually being mutilated without our consent or knowledge. And that's a thing that people are allowing to go by. So that's a slippery slope argument right there that came true. And it's affecting churches too. And you can go back into probably the same time period when all these things kind of started to turn around. Like I said, after World War II, this was kind of a trigger in our society. World War II was a trigger of a lot of things. And a lot of churches were seeing these changes in society and thought, we ought to adapt and go along and try and be relevant in these kind of movements that are happening. And the first churches that did that were the mainline denominations. And they started liberalizing their doctrines. And as they further liberalize their doctrines, they tend, whenever you do that, you hit a wall. Because the more liberal and progressive you make it, you try and make your doctrines in your church or your church's stance, you eventually run up against the Bible. And the Bible is probably the least progressive, most illiberal book by our standards, by the modern standards that you can have. Now, by history standards, it's the most progressive, liberating book in the world. But you lose sight of that. Excuse me. It started with the mainline denominations, and they eventually had to abandon the Bible. Really, if you look at a lot of the, especially things like the Presbyterian Church, Episcopal Church for sure has been the one that has gone the farthest, to the point where they have, pastors with rainbow vestments on, wearing makeup and all of that. I'm not sure what all I can and can't say about that for trigger words here, but what did it say? Catholics had to go to their priest, right? So, and now the Catholic Church has gone that way with Pope Francis. No, a lot of people are saying that Pope Leo is now turning that around. Hopefully that's the case. I mean, I'm not Catholic. I've got my severe concerns about the Catholic Church, but that's at least a good model of how far a church can go doctrinally in liberalizing and eventually abandoning Christian principles. And again, that's the slippery slope. That little kernel, that little seed back whenever that was started in the 50s or the 60s, because the mainline denominations after World War II were huge. It's where everybody went to church until they started liberalizing. And I know the church that I went to as a child, was a mainline denomination, and it doesn't exist anymore. Because when I was probably 10 or 11 years old, I heard the gospel from from a typical 70s guy, beard and the jeans and the flowered belt and whatever. This guy came in strumming a guitar. They had us go to a youth group because we couldn't sit still in church, so they developed this youth group, and this guy was talking about accepting Christ as your Savior, that Jesus died for us, his sin, for payment for our sins, and if we repent and turn to him and accept this gift of salvation, we will have eternal life. Never heard that before. And then eventually my sister and I went to a church that had a better youth group, but this little mainline denomination church no longer exists, because after that, they went full on social justice, liberation theology, whatever you would want to call it. And they don't exist anymore. I don't even know if that denomination exists anymore. They went so liberal. And now it's coming for the evangelical church. And I will talk about this tomorrow with Ben some more, but I had a heartbreaking experience this week with my old church that we went to for years and our kids grew up in, and what they decided to do to appease modern progressive culture. And this is a very influential church. It was a very rock solid church when we went there, but I went there 17 years ago, and I started hearing these little things here and there come out, and seeing little things in this church. And I was talking with a member of the staff, and he was very bewildered by the turn this church has taken. And he said, "How did you know this was going to happen?" And I said, "It was obvious to me." And he's like, "Well, you apparently you see patterns better than everybody else did." But this is a huge thing in our area, and I'll talk about it more with Ben tomorrow. But that's one other reason that got me going on this slippery slope, because little compromises, little changes, trying to adapt to a changing world is a challenge. And you have to really prayerfully consider anything you do as a church or in your Christian life to appease or to make yourself relevant. You have to absolutely do it with a sense of, will this further the gospel, and not with the sense of, will this make me popular with the world? Will this make me popular with the non-Christian people I'm trying to reach? And most of these things that happen with the mainline denominations, Catholics, whatever you want, and now with evangelical denominations, is we have wanted to appear to be reasonable, appear to be woke, whatever you would want to call it, appear to be progressive, and to the world, to get them to somehow, we think if they see us as good progressive people, they'll listen to our non-progressive message, and they won't. The more you try to appeal and compromise with the world on biblical principles, you will not change the world. The world will change you. And it'll change your church, and it'll change your walk with God, your personal walk with God. The more you try and make yourself popular, you have to realize, no matter how nice you are, if you hold to Christian principles, you will be unpopular, and you have to be okay with that. You have to be okay with people saying all kinds of evil against you. Jesus said that. He said, "Because of me, people will hate you," and we have to come to terms with that. And we can't buy into the world's argument that if we hold to Christian principles, we'll be hateful people. We're not. We have to accept the situation we're in, that if we hold to Christian principles, we will be unpopular, but that doesn't mean we're unloving people. That doesn't mean we're bad people. It means we're people, Christians. We follow Jesus, and that's what makes us unpopular. But it also will reach the people we need to reach. The good harvest, the people of good harvest, people with good soil will see the message and see that it feeds their soul. It feeds what they're searching for. even though the rest of the world will reject it. And I'm out of time. I could go on with this for all day. I can talk about this. Ben and I will talk about it a little more tomorrow. So sorry to go over time, but thanks for tuning in, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye now.